Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to High Fantasy Podcast. This is Morgan. We got another author interview for you, number 3. Today we are speaking with Mr. James Wolanyk. James is the author of the Scribes Cycle, published almost exactly a year ago, and the post-apocalyptic novel Grid. James is an English language teacher and has taught in many interesting places, including the Czech Republic, Taiwan, and most recently Latvia. Outside of writing, James enjoys history, philosophy, and boxing. We thoroughly enjoyed speaking with James. He's a really intelligent guy. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Cheers. So alrighty, folks, thanks for tuning in. And we're here with Mr. James Wolanyk. James, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to virtually be here.
Indeed, yes. Power of the internet. So James, just please go ahead and describe yourself a little bit, and as well as your work, and tell us a bit about what you're currently engaged with.
All right. Well, yeah, first of all, good intro. I think that covered pretty much all the major beats. Yeah, like you said, I am a teacher. I'm an English teacher, and I'm also doing marketing this year. So that's something that I did before I started teaching. I was actually involved in like freelance editing and that sort of thing. And so I'm just basically here at an international school, and I'm currently, of course, doing fiction writing while I'm here. I really enjoy anything related to kind of, as you said, philosophy, but also spirituality, just methods of thinking and methods of analysis. I wouldn't call myself like a horoscope sort of person when it comes to spirituality. I'm not really big into things that I can't really prove myself. So that's how I approach, I think, a lot of life. I approach thinking, fiction, whatever, as something that usually has to come from direct experience, as opposed to just, I don't know, making things up, I guess. I like to really try to capture a sense of realism in the writing that I do, which I think is a bit different than maybe the methodology that a lot of other fantasy writers tend to take. Which is fine. Everybody has their their style of writing, of course. But that's the one thing I think I've noticed about myself that is a bit different, let's say.
Interesting. So it's an empirical-based fantasy and spirituality. It's quite
if such a thing can exist, yeah.
Yeah.
You've traveled a lot, James, and you're currently in Latvia. And do you find that your writing is different when you're in different countries? How does traveling affect your writing and what you write about?
Question. So actually, thank you for bringing it up. I never actually considered it. But yeah, I think the writing does change, but I would say that it's hard to tell why it changes. Part of it could just be that the type of fiction that I'm consuming in a certain place changes. So when I was in Taiwan, for example, there was a lot of time to do walking around, and that was really cool because I would use it to listen to a lot of slower paced fiction books where I could listen to them, on Audible or whatever. And a lot of kind of literary stuff started to creep in as a result of listening to that stuff. But when I've been in some other places where there's just, I don't know, some really exciting fantasy that I can get my hands on in a local bookstore, that's a place where it will start to shift, I think, as well. As far as the actual surroundings, like geographic location things, I think that it definitely influences the content that goes into the books. Maybe not the style of writing, but definitely the elements in the stories. There's always a little kind of piece of wherever I've gone, I think, embedded in the world somewhere. So that's very insightful to ask.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm asking because my reading week is coming up soon, and I'm in school, so I'm actually going to Martinique for a week, and I want to spend a lot of time writing. So I'm just curious if that sort of experience will happen to me as well.
Oh wow,
it's kind of
that's
first
cool.
time going. So yeah, so it's kind of a personal related question, I guess.
Yeah, it is an interesting one, and something that we've noticed, James. We've done a couple of interviews with other fantasy authors as well at this point, and it seems like it's a pretty common theme. Especially those who have traveled before and have lived abroad. Their life experience informs a lot of what they write, and it seems like such an obvious thing, but
upon further reflection, like it goes a lot deeper than just, oh, I was around people who spoke another language and that made me want to explore having foreign characters. Or, it's
Sure.
it's a lot more than that. Like, and it's kind of interesting. And as I think that's what fantasy is kind of all about, is really about writing your own life experiences in a way, and or even kind of living vicariously through others and trying to imagine it.
No, I think you're spot on. There's a good observation there, and one of the interesting things about what you said is this idea that fantasy, in a way, or of course all writing, but especially fantasy, I think, is an exaggeration of the things that we think about very often, and they're things that we don't really filter into direct literary experience. When people write fantasy books, they're taking the bedrock kind of archetypal images that they think about, or the themes maybe, and putting them into these worlds. So I think that you might be right that there is maybe more of a, this mental bleed off effect into fantasy than maybe some other genres, which is cool to think about.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, like from a psychological point of view. Yeah, something worth looking into. So, James, on Twitter, you described Scribes as a non-Western literary philosophical, full of magnetic rifles and kick-ass young women. So this description really excites me personally, but I wouldn't say it's a normal hook for a fantasy novel. Can you break this down for us a little bit? And why did you choose to write such unconventional topics for your fantasy?
It's really difficult to answer. Like, I feel like it's one of those things where you do something you almost regret, and people ask you later why you did it, and you're not quite sure. I guess the simple answer is that it's very hard in some ways to market what your book is about succinctly in this day and age. So it's very difficult for people at a first glance beyond the cover to really know what they're reading. And when I was trying to advertise this book to people, because primarily I'm not really about trying to drive up huge sales. I would just like it if people knew that the book was out there. That's the foremost goal of marketing, right? So part of that was just, let's boil it down to what I think makes the book unique and try to push those angles. And the things that I picked out were obviously that there are philosophical ideas. So people that are into maybe Erickson's work or anything from the Second Apocalypse, people could come from that, or from Dune. The literary angle is mostly because most of my kind of mentoring and workshop stuff that I did in university was under the direct influence of a literary writer. I don't know if you know this book, House of Sand and Fog. The guy who wrote this book was my mentor, and really cool guy, but he's always pushing me toward literary. So it, of course, came into the fantasy world in the way that the prose was written. And then, of course, magnetic rifles. There are magnetic rifles. I don't want to be false advertising. And the kick-ass young women. It was mostly just that I know that these days we are trying to be more inclusive, and I think that people who are looking for a different reading experience of those sort of things might be more interested just by seeing that it's not yet another farm boy who's kind of stumbled into the world against the evil empire. It's like, okay, maybe it's about a group of people that we haven't always seen directly dealt with in fantasy. And if we do see it dealt with in fantasy, it's usually through the angle or the lens of young adult, instead of being proper adult fiction just taking place from a younger person's point of view.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic as well, because I've always kind of wondered, like in like Lord of the Rings, for example, like what do the kids think? All these crazy adults, like, horses and swords and stuff, and they're just kind of like scared all the time. Yeah, it's got to be quite harrowing. But yeah, and it's an interesting thing, because then because you're an adult writer and you have to then almost place yourself into the mind of someone who is younger, and then in a way, like, would you say that you have to simplify your thinking, or is it like, does that at all take place, do you think? Because you're not really like a child won't think of what you're experiencing with the same level of sophistication necessarily as an adult would.
I think, yeah, that's a very interesting situation to look at, and part of that, I think you hit the nail on the head by just mentioning the fact that it is in some ways about the authenticity of this person. So how are they thinking? What is their mental inner world like? And part of that came from definitely from working with students in real life, noticing that they do a lot of things that are inconsistent. They do a lot of things that people maybe outside would call dumb, making bad choices, and they don't know why they do them sometimes. And there's this whole complicated mess of psychological traumas that everybody's experiencing on a daily basis, and most people never really come to terms with them, but they form kind of who we are. And it was interesting to work with students and see what their inner life was like as a result of the world around them, and the way that they thought about things and the way that they approached situations. And in general, just to say, okay, let's try to write a book from the perspective of a person who has this set of knowledge and lacks this set of knowledge, right? So that's really what we're dealing with young people, is they have concepts that people have given to them. I mean, adults too, not just young people, of course, but of all ages. People are dealing with concepts that they've been given and concepts that they can understand in their own minds, and trying to kind of extrapolate and make hopefully logical guesses about the way that the world at large works. And sometimes people are successful with that, and sometimes not so much. And the moments when they're not successful are the moments that end up being, I'd say, the most dramatic in the writing, because you see consequences of illogical or kind of immature thinking and what it leads to sometimes. And it's not always the best outcome for a situation.
Yeah, that's very true. Like if you think about sort of the development psychology of adolescents or young people, you kind of see it reflected in fantasy in general, because a lot of fantasy is a coming of age story or coming into your own power kind of story. Mm-hmm. Like I can't think of many fantasies who don't follow that arc. It's called Bildungsroman in sort of the literary terms.
Right.
So I guess, yeah, so the whole young adult mind is kind of set up for that rich exploration into fantasy, I would say.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, and James, you did point it out, I think, or like allude to it, fantasy is something that's not just beneficial to the young mind. Like we just spoke with a couple of authors who are like middle-aged men, well into their 40s, if not 50s, and they get the same type of meaning from the stories that they both read, but also the ones that they create. Mm-hmm. And but they just see it a little bit differently, obviously, having had more experience in life and different things happen, and presumably have had a lot more hardship than the young person would have in many cases, perhaps.
Right.
It's very philosophical, this chat. It's pretty good.
Okay, it's great.
Fitting, so, yes.
So with your sort of unconventional take on fantasy, did you find it easier or more difficult to make yourself stand out and get a publisher and do all these sorts of things that are sort of traditionally aligned with being an author?
Yeah, it was a very unique and complex and weird process to get something published. And truthfully, I don't know the extent to which some of the things that I like to write about helped or hindered the book being published. There was some reservation from the onset, I guess, from publishers about taking on something where the protagonist was so young and it wasn't YA. That was a big thing. It's not really a philosophical point, but it's just a moral or kind of ethical point, that they were worried about some of the more like violent or just in general menacing overtones that were present in this world when you have somebody who's it's not really specified, but let's say between 13 and 15 walking around in this world. And it's sort of the default response is, but really bad things could happen to this person. And it's like, well, I know that's why it's written that way. So that was a big one that was interesting to deal with. As far as the spiritual stuff, I think the first book of the series is not as it's not as prevalent in a lot of it, not until the end. But it did definitely help, I think, to establish a really cool bond with the editor for the series. So over at Kensington, another James, ironically, is the editor for the project. And fun fact, the marketing guy for the project is also a James. So there's 3 Jameses working on one book series, which is awesome. And it's very hard to organize emails a lot of the time. But it was really cool, like to email with the editor and say like, hey, would you let me go just bananas with this crazy spiritual content in the books? And he was all over it because he himself is interested in those things. So I think as far as just getting the totality of the book's message out there, the spiritual aspect was helpful in letting me push a few of the boundaries that I think another publisher or another editor might not have been as generous with. So yes, that's a very cool aspect of it.
That's great. And did you, like, are you actively putting sort of spiritual and philosophical things into your work, or do you just find that you write about this stuff kind of naturally? Like, what's sort of the impetus that makes you write about these things? And can you give a little example maybe from your books of sort of a spiritual episode or something from the book?
Everything spiritual. Just kidding. But in essence, I mean, that, as facetious as that sounds, the statement, it's trying to describe something that is fundamental to the books. And I think that's the idea that I want people to approach fantasy as something that's not necessarily separate from our world. So when people look at fantasy, like you guys were alluding to as well, it should be a mirror for reality. It's a mirror of kind of our collective psyche as a culture. And I think that when we begin to treat aspects of a fantasy book like they're completely, fantastical and out there and whatever, we lose some of the ability to gain information and learn from the things that we're reading. But there is tremendous psychological authenticity and kind of curiosity to what we write in fantasy. And I guess furthermore, when it comes to overt spiritual stuff, there are some instances of it. People who are really into spiritual stuff, you two probably could pick out some interesting aspects. There's a lot of words that are somewhat related to Sanskrit or to Pali or to any of the other different languages that I think some of these traditions have been in. And it's, in some ways, it's almost an Easter egg. It's like, hey, people, if you're interested, you can go dig up what this word actually means and how it's been used in our world. But what I mean about this pervasiveness of the content of fantasy in our world is really that there should be no difference between the way that a sentient being in a fantasy book approaches mastering the nature of the mind and the way that we do in our world. Because I think that is sort of one of the core ideas of Hinduism or Buddhism or a lot of these systems that acknowledge maybe multiple world interpretations, right? Is that beings are born everywhere and all beings have the same problem, which is that they suffer. And the causes of suffering are the same, no matter if you're, some god or some demon or an animal or whatever, but that certain beings are able to address that suffering more easily than others. So the books definitely have characters who represent monastic traditions. They definitely have rituals that mirror a lot of the spiritual traditions. There's a scene, to give a direct example, there's a scene from the third book, without giving too many spoilers, of course, but you have this girl who's kind of suffered her whole life and she's just looking for answers. And when she meets this personification of sort of, the magic or whatever, it kind of shows her the way that reality is. And it shows her, beings arising from nothingness, going back to nothingness. And the fact that she's been reborn, hundreds of thousands of times. And so there is direct reference to a lot of these traditions, but I wouldn't say it's in a preachy sort of proselytizing way for them. It's just a presentation, if you will, of some of the surface level concepts to these religions.
Yeah, that's like just so incredibly fascinating. We can probably do like 3 hours just talking about that, like at least. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think this is just my own kind of opinion, I think, but maybe Shalini can also talk about, because I think we have talked about this a little bit, like just the two of us, where I don't know if you find this too, James, but in a lot of fantasy, I know it's kind of a generic way of just like a lot of fantasy, like how much is it, 50% or more? But a lot of it, I find like there's the lack of religion is just so apparent in a lot of these stories, and we're inserted into these worlds. In many cases, it's a totally different universe than ours, and there's different races and beings, and there's magic. But then there won't be religion or allusions to that even existing in the world, like, at all. And if there is, like, it'll be, like, oh, praise be the gods, or like these, like, and you have no idea what that means, or if the characters are actually moved by any, like, by any moral force that is not just like their own self-interest and, and the want for power and for wealth or for glory or something.
Mm-hmm.
And
it kind of reflects, I guess, the secularized society that we think we live in today.
Yeah.
And kind of moving away from those sort of aspects. So it's kind of interesting tracing how fantasy reflects sort of real world ideas. Like a lot of fantasy is interested in political drama and things like that today, which is obviously something that's very big in sort of the global consciousness of real life. And just thinking about some examples of good sort of integration of religion into fantasy. I'm listening to the audiobook of N.K. Jemisin's The Killing Moon. I don't know if...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So from what I know from right now, it's a huge book, but I think it kind of covers, like, there's these reapers who do the work of the higher entity, I believe. And it's kind of, there's like a... Shoot, I don't actually know that much about the book. I always listen to it before I fall asleep, so I zone in and out,
Right.
But I do get this sort of religious sense that these people are moved by the higher entities, who also imbue people with a sort of magic and spiritual purpose at the same time.
Yeah.
Which I think is super interesting, to think about religion as an actual method of attaining magic.
Yeah. It's so weird, right? Because in some senses, and I think you might have, like, alluded to this in a way, which is in a lot of these stories, like, religion, or it's not religion, magic is like the substitute for religion or for spirituality.
Yes.
Like in the Harry Potter universe, like, we have no idea if these people consider themselves to be Christians or Muslims or Jews, Buddhists.
Right.
It's just, I presume that, like, for them, magic is kind of like the be all end all, right? I mean, if you can get, make your spoon stir your coffee, like, just by itself, and, you can cast amazingly powerful spells. And there's even direct references to immortality in J.K. Rowling's books, and it's explored a little bit as a concept. So
it's definitely influenced by Christian ideas, and she's kind of talked about that as well.
Yeah.
But it would be the characters themselves.
I just think it would be so preposterous if, like, at the end, Harry just gets on his knees and starts praying and, does a sign of the cross. It just seems so inappropriate and out of place, because there's just none of that actual,
And speaking of Christianity as well, it's interesting to think about how modern fantasy was created through Tolkien, in a way. Like, he is kind of the first sort of iteration of what we call modern fantasy, and he did it through a very sort of Christian lens, and he was kind of creating a mythology for English history, obviously not marrying it to Christianity too much, but obviously if you keep reading into it, you get a lot of the sort of Christian imagery and Christian motives and ethos, and you can almost imagine everyone who's a good member of a race to actually be a Christian. You can kind of imagine that. Probably not in the same way that we humans do.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. We have talked about that, but the fact still remains, and I hate to, like, I feel like I'm throwing like a wrench into the gears here with this comment, but there's still no reference to religion in any meaningful sense in Tolkien's works.
Yeah.
Which is why it's funny, like, there's no reference to God or gods. It's just kind of like, I guess, implied that there is religion in this universe and spirituality.
That is what I find interesting to a degree, is that when we look at fantasy, you can distinguish the work that is religious by nature of the prose itself, so how it presents in the world, and then religion that is fantasy that is framed by the religious intent of the author. So you might have a highly Judeo-Christian world where you have a clear division of good and evil. And in Tolkien's eyes, the races are not created equally, right? It is a deeply racist world in the literal sense of the word, in that elves are higher than orcs. Men are higher than orcs or whatever kind of foul creatures. And what you get in Grimdark a lot of these days is this, and I think in general, in a broader context for fantasy, but especially Grimdark, you see it in a very cynical way, is the complete wholesale rejection of Christian kind of mythology and dualistic modes of thinking in favor of this just chaotic froth of ideologies and competing motives, where there is no binding force to the world, and it's this anarchist depiction of human values and human nature. And I think what's so off base about it, in a sense, not that there's anything wrong with a narrative exploring the kind of baseless disagreement that goes on about human values and morality, but to not have any aspect of positive religious presence in the world is a bit strange, because even in our own world, even if we're a staunch atheist or critic of religion, we can still see that there are some traits that have obviously kept religion alive this long, because humans gravitate toward it. So there must be something valuable that humans extract from the process of worship, or from just whatever religious tradition is present within that world. But when you have it in Grimdark, it's sort of like, okay, if there's any type of church, they are sacrificing children and eating people, and just all these weird kind of reactionary depictions of Catholicism and the weird ritualism. It's like the 80s never died. It's like the religious critique of Catholicism has never ended. And I don't know. It seems like there is room for more nuanced takes on organized religion in a fantasy setting.
It's so interesting thinking about fantasy, because fantasy is it almost seems like the opposite of sort of Christian ideas, because it's obviously a lot to do with like witchcraft and free thinking and things like that. But it's always kind of been intertwined with fantasy, even back to Beowulf, because Beowulf was written in sort of a Christian, but I think it was a Christian person. It's anonymous. We don't really know who wrote it. But obviously Beowulf would have been pagan, but it's set in a lens that's Christian. And sort of that sort of entanglement has never really unfolded through all the iterations of fantasy that we have coming to today. But it's interesting that you're putting sort of a sort of Eastern, I think, Eastern sort of spin on the spirituality discussion when it comes to fantasy as well. Because, as you said, there's a lot of similarities between how fantasy kind of operates in the sort of different worlds, and the sort of ontology of spiritual Eastern religion and fantasy is kind of similar. And I don't think a lot of people picked up on that.
I love it. I love how erudite this has become. This is a great. This is like a university tutorial. This is fantastic.
Religion 101.
Academy. Welcome.
I love it. So James, I guess just going back to before we were talking about you're a teacher and you've obviously witnessed a lot of immaturity, and I would imagine by this point you've developed a bit of a thick skin when it comes to dealing with criticism and that kind of stuff. And we would just like to talk a little bit about Goodreads. Shalini and I, Goodreads does a lot of great things for authors that are up and coming, and we've talked about it a little bit with the other authors that we've spoken with, and we do get differing opinions about it. Like, to me, when I see a lot of the comments about novels, like it's clear that the people haven't really read the full thing, and sometimes they comment on the wrong novel and it ends up kind of sabotaging the review, like the overall rating for the author's book. And sometimes it goes down to the level of like they're basically just like YouTube comments for books. And you talk a little bit about this in your blog, and I just would like to hear what you think about the impact of reviews, especially in this day and age, for people who are trying to become.
Yeah, I mean, we have a situation globally where we are beginning to see the loss of like gatekeepers, if you will. So in all regards, the ability to spread not only opinions but works of art, of course, is increasing. So what that means is this huge proliferation of new films, like short films coming out from independent people, independent video games. You have, of course, self-published books. You have just, it runs the gamut. You have SoundCloud rap. You have everything created by just anybody who can put it up. I've made a SoundCloud rap song. That's how easy it is. It will never be shared because it was kind of tongue in cheek, but you never know how it how it looks. But anyway, the point is that anybody can make anything, and that also means reviews. And we need to kind of come to I think a global consensus of like we're either okay with people being gatekeepers for a certain industry and only letting the opinion of people who quote unquote know what they're talking about give opinions for works of art or things like that, or we allow everybody to be an equal critic. And I think that that's definitely the fairer and more reasonable option, is to let everybody express themselves however they want to. But what it also means is that we need to be more discerning as readers and writers about what we take seriously from people. Because obviously anybody can put out a 1-second short film of just the color green, and it's a film, but you can also have somebody make something like Dunkirk or whatever, and they're not comparable. And the opinions of people who really like the green video, the 1-second green clip, because it's absurd, them giving it 5 stars does not necessarily mean that product is more worthwhile or has more attention put into it than Dunkirk did, even if somebody gives it 4 stars and says, the ending was unsatisfying. So there's gradients of how worthwhile criticism is, and I think it depends on the intention of the reviewer. If somebody gives a 1-star review to the book and is very earnest about it and explains why they didn't like it, and they say that the pacing was not to my liking, and this character didn't work for me, and just goes down the list, I mean, sure, that's fine. But if somebody leaves a 1-star review saying like what happened to the dog, which is a real kind of review clip I've had before, which is funny because there's not a dog in the entire book, so I was very confused. But that kind of comment, how am I supposed to equate that with a 2-star review where somebody actually gives me reasons as to why they didn't like the book? So I'd say that's my experience. It's been a process of learning to be okay with whatever reviews I receive, but also learning to extract valuable things from the feedback that I do get.
Yeah, it's a very earnest and for lack of a better word, a mature and wise way of looking at it, I think, because you can't take it personally. I think there's a weird stereotype where I think folks assume that a lot of people that are very creative take criticism to heart, like very personally. But I don't find that that's my experience, having met a lot of like even people who are outside of this writing, like artists and musicians and whatnot. I think it's kind of, they're actually quite strong in that regard, and
well, they know it's to benefit their craft, but like you said, James, you kind of have to filter through the ones that are actually productive, as opposed to the ones that are just written by insecure people who haven't published anything themselves, and they feel like they have to vindicate other people for doing so.
Yeah, I think the world needs to be educated on how to decide what is and what isn't a valid criticism or a valid opinion. In the sense that, is it really meaningful to improving your, it depends obviously who it's coming from and the context, like you just kind of pointed out.
There's a lot behind it, and part of it too, with the 1-star reviews that I got upon further Goodreads stalking, I discovered that basically a lot of the 1-star reviews were written by people who were into what Kensington historically put out, which is in their main imprint. I mean, not Rebel Base, but Kensington itself. They usually put out romantic or paranormal or urban fantasy books. And I think that people, when they saw the cover for this book, and it's quite tame by fantasy or grimdark standards, when they saw the cover, they're like, "Oh, it's blue, and it looks nice. It's got a female character. It's got Anna. Oh, she's the Civil War. Oh, Hunger Games had a Civil War. So there's all these mental associations of what you're expecting with the book. And when people opened it, they start reading and they're getting this like Cormac McCarthy just bloodbath of terrible people, and they're like, what is this thing? This is worse than the satanic verses, and so a lot of people just unleashed their opinions, and it was clear from their reading history. I don't fault them, but it was pretty clear that this was not their type of book, and they were looking for something other than what they got. Which is understandable. If you buy Jell-O at the store, you don't want chocolate pudding when you get home. But I don't usually leave 1-star reviews on the chocolate pudding's website just because it was chocolate pudding instead of Jell-O. Not that that's an analogy for anything.
True. I think there has to be a sort of reordering of reader expectations going in, and trying to not let that influence you. I know it's very hard because obviously reading is very subjective, as all art is. So you're bringing your preconceived notions into it. But something you said, James, that I wanted to pick up on is this idea of shifting what critiques are for. So, I mean, in this day and age, we kind of have to change the way we look at 4-star reviews or 5-star reviews, or just the stars in general, because it doesn't actually reflect, as you said, the effort or the sophistication of a novel per se. It's just based on what other people think, and people think that people who are reviewing are like objective. They might have a sophisticated idea, because we're still in this mode of thinking that people who review are more intellectual, have seen and read more, but that's not necessarily the case, because anyone with a computer can write a review now. So
Yeah.
kind of have to build that into our psyche as we're looking at reviews, because I'm kind of guilty of that too. Like, I'll see a book that's like 3.6, and I'd be like, oh, I don't know if I'd read that.
Yeah.
But then I looked at one of my favorite books. It's a young adult fantasy called 3 Dark Crowns, and it was a pretty low 4, and I gave it a 5 because I thought it was amazing. And I was like, oh, if I saw this review, I may not have picked it up, but I thought it was really good.
Yeah. So
you kind of have to,
So in a way, there's something to be said as well about like sometimes just not going on the internet and looking up.
For once, just not use the internet.
like I actually judge the book by its cover and go, oh, it's nice and blue, and there's a good looking female lead character. Why not try something a little old school for once?
Yeah.
Oh.
James, you like writing essays and kind of thinking deeply about the writing that you do and the sort of genre that you write in. So there's an essay that you wrote called The Agnostic Paladin, Belief in Ontology and Fantasy. And I was really excited about this because I'm an English master's student. So I'm kind of, ontology is a word I know, which is not necessarily a word many people do. So I'd just like to read an excerpt that I thought was very interesting and kind of talk about it. So this is from your essay. We are all seeking a state of permanent happiness, an escape from fear, a retreat from pain. We are seeking the attributes or shelter of a permanent being. The answers to life's design may or may not be apparent to fantasy characters, but as soon as those questions of existence begin to arise, there is no way to bury them. Fantasy offers a chance to experiment with how a conscious moral agent can make peace with their own conceptions of reality, and in doing so, to understand how these characters are a mirror for our own quest. So we've already kind of talked about how fantasy is a mirror for today's sort of society, but you really pick on something interesting here, because in this essay you actually talk about impermanence and our sort of quest to find a permanent sort of state of happiness or contentment without suffering, and how it's kind of reflected in fantasy. And a lot of the protagonists are given these very overwhelming quests and conflicts that they have to deal with, and they can't really back out. And this is kind of something I also explore in my own novel, because it's basically about 2 teenagers who are kidnapped by aliens. Those aliens tell them you have 1 year to change climate change and poverty and war on your planet, otherwise it's going to be destroyed. And
Oh,
so
wow.
yeah, it's a big commitment.
Tall order.
Yeah. So the main protagonist is in this sort of liminal space of fear. Like, she doesn't want to actually do it. She just wants to stay on this alien planet and not take up this burden. So the first
Right.
novel is about her exploration of if she wants to do it or if she doesn't want to do it, and just kind of leave her race and move on. So that is kind of an interesting idea of reflecting our own sort of ideas about these huge sort of conflicts that are going on in our world. On the other hand, people don't have this very sophisticated idea about fantasy necessarily. When they think about fantasy, they think about dragons and riches and magic and elves and dwarves and something that's like a very fun adventure, but not necessarily reflective, as you said, about fantasy. About real life necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So is this a stereotype that you actively try to combat in your writing, or can you just say more, I guess, about this topic?
Yeah, I can, and I think, truth be told, I don't usually write anything as a defense for the genre or anything, because I myself have my own problems with it, and it's a lot of my desire to write fantasy came from the fact that I would read fantasy and feel unfulfilled by it, or feel like something was missing from it, and I think among people who write fantasy, there's a tendency to read a lot of fantasy, and the issue that results from that is that you lose touch, in a sense, with more realistic fiction, which is not to say that realistic fiction is inherently better than fantasy, but that if you look at writers like, let's say, Raymond Carver or even Hemingway, right? People are very ambivalent about these writers, and some people love them, and some people, could care less for them. But these writers really captured the human condition well, and the way in which people behave, and the way in which people hide things from each other, and just all these twisted little nooks and crannies in the human spirit. And that's something that I wanted to help contribute to, was that people no longer looked at fantasy as just this kind of vapid exploration of magic and whatever, but really people dealing with very earnest problems that we all have. And so in that way, I never set out to prove those people wrong, that fantasy is that way. My own mentor was that way. He doesn't like fantasy still, really, but he liked something about Scribes, because he said that it managed to pull those two together. So I suppose, on the one level you want to prove them wrong, but on the other hand, it's the only way that I really know how to write. I would love to be able to write something really fun and pulpy and Conan-ish. But I just don't have it in me, really. I don't know why. It always seems to come back to something that's more kind of poignant, like has something more to say about the person than about the cool stuff that they're doing. Although Conan does a lot of really cool stuff, so I won't disparage him too much on this podcast. But yeah.
So I guess just talking a bit more about the fantasy genre, what is your sort of ideal fantasy read? Maybe something you're reading right now?
I have a lot of books on Audible that I have not listened to yet, but the most recent fantasy book that I read and really liked, let's see. I read The Vagrant a lot later than most people did, by Peter Newman, but that's a really phenomenal book. I also, as I said before, I really like Stephen Erickson. The Malazan series is really good. The fantasy that I read is typically stuff that I would describe as complex in a lot of ways, but not always complex. Sometimes it has to do more with the style. So cinematic fantasy I really like. I liked the Black Prism, the Lightbringer series.
Yes, Brent Weeks.
Yeah, I was really into that. Even though it was like a little bit more fun than kind of heady in some senses, it was a fun ride, and like I enjoyed that aspect of it. Yeah, but I'll say for now, books like The Vagrant or which book was it? The Hod King, I think, is coming out pretty soon, or it dropped already. I'm not sure, but definitely the Senlin Ascends And yeah, anything that Josiah Bancroft puts out is good. I like anything that's a little bit more unusual, I guess, than the Tolkien-esque fantasy. It's not saying that it's bad, of course. It's just that I've read a lot of it in recent years, and I'm kind of cleansing my palate for a little while before I come back and go back into it.
It's good to get the different flavors.
Yeah.
See for
It's
sure.
like froyo.
Yeah.
Yeah, having some froyo after gouging yourself.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
After some ice cream, we talked to Alan Batchelder yesterday, and he used to work at an ice cream store for quite a few years, and he was talking about the different flavors of ice cream, relating it to fantasy. So
lots of ice cream metaphors.
Because fantasy is rich and delightful and addicting. That's why.
You don't want to have the same flavor all the time.
But James, so as we're coming towards the end of the podcast, it'd be good to get a bit more of a. Could you like sell your book to us? Like give us a little pitch about what this book is and why people should read it.
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot or anything. You know?
I mean, I feel the pressure. Let's see. I would sell it from the angle that the book is about very real problems from our world. So war and intolerance and power struggles, but it's explored from an angle of I think a lot of humanity. So a lot of sympathy for the humans themselves, the characters that are going through things, and it's not really a competition to see how many cool things can be shoved into a book, but it's more about how we can deal with a really terrible world situation and still find some measure of peace in ourselves, I guess. So if you're looking for a book that's maybe a bit transformative as well as being a fun read, I think it's definitely a contender for that category. I won't hype it up too much because I don't want to disappoint people, but I think that people would get a kick out of that aspect, especially if they're into spirituality.
Wow, that's fantastic. So James, give us a sense of where we can find you, like your sites, blogs, social media people can follow you on, and where they could find your books for sale.
This would be a great time to plug my SoundCloud career, but I won't.
You're going to announce your rap career on this podcast?
Yeah.
The world premiere. Let's see. As far as the places I check the most would be on Facebook. I do have an author page, but people can just friend me directly. I'm not really too picky about that. I'm also on Twitter. It would be JP Wolanyk is the full name. Of course, I have Amazon where all the books are listed. And I do have an email address, but of course, people can write to me on Facebook if they want to send an email with anything for me to check out, or I don't know. Sometimes people just send interesting attachments like cat photos or something. So I'm open to cat photos. If anybody wants to do an internet throwback.
Anything that you're working on in the near future that is of note you want people to know about?
Two quick things. One is that I have officially signed a deal with Aethon Books to put out a sci-fi thriller.
Oh, wow.
It's an alternate history, pretty cool thing. It's kind of like Blade Runner 2049 if you mixed it up with like X-Files. So it's a very weird, different take from fantasy, but it's still really interesting. The second thing that I'm working on now is a new fantasy series, and it will be called, tentatively, it's called The Ladders of God, and it's about another universe 7,000 years after an apocalypse, where this terrible event kind of destroyed their world. Spacefaring technology, nanites, all kind of crazy things, and in its place you've got two umpires. One of them's very driven by technology and trying to get up to this space station orbiting their world to bring their God back into the world, and the other side is more of a monastic tradition that's trying to suppress technology, and it turns into this huge battle with all the realms colliding and rebirth and all kinds of crazy steampunk, diesel punk shenanigans. So that's a crammed into a mailbox, but the basic premise.
Yeah, awesome.
That sounds amazing. Can't wait to read that as well.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, I just love how important the works that you're doing, James. Like, this is really fantastic to hear about, and we're really pumped to get to know more about your writing and reading further as well.
Yeah.
It means a lot. I'm very excited to just talk about it with, I guess, people who also have a personal interest in topics about it and things of that nature.
So, Mr. James Wolanyk, thank you very much for coming on the High Fantasy Podcast. You're a very interesting individual who has a lot of things to say about very complex topics, and you're quite the head in the clouds kind of character. But it's kind of, it's something that we're finding more and more that we talk to authors of fantasy. That's kind of how they are, and it's quite remarkable. But they're still quite down to earth and friendly, and you were both today, and we really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Very thrilled to again virtually be here and discuss some really interesting topics, and of course, thank you very much for the great questions.
For sure. Thanks so much, James.
All right, take care, guys.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well.